Well, good afternoon if you are in the great state of Texas or the great state of New York. Good evening if you are in the wonderful former capital of Italy, which is Turin, Torino, as I call it. Greetings to people all over the world, and welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all over the world. My guest today is someone I've known for a long time. I've followed her career since its very beginnings, or nearly so, and she is a remarkable artist. She is an American, or perhaps she will correct me and say a Texan, named Laura Claycomb, who lives in Torino, in Turin, one of my favorite cities in the world. And therefore, we will probably talk about Texas and talk about Torino, and we'll talk about being a soprano and also being a very well-regarded educator. So, Laura, welcome.
Thank you. So wonderful to see you.
Likewise. Now, let's start with Texas. It is a much misunderstood place. It's a very large place geographically. It is a very diverse place.
hmm
It, I believe, as a New Yorker, lives on its own mythology, and sometimes it believes it's mythology, and sometimes the mythology is true. Um, I don't think you can easily categorize Texas at all. I will say in full disclosure that I've been in much of the state, but I've never been to Houston. And my friends in Dallas always say, friends don't let friends go to Houston. But I disagree. I know that Houston is a remarkable cultural city with one of the great opera companies of the United States, with a wonderful symphony, with remarkable museums, a wonderful food scene, great diversity. And I'm very eager to go to Houston. I'm putting that out there in the world. It's the major American city that I've never been to.
I can't
So
believe it.
I would very much like to go to Houston. But where are you from in Texas?
I'm from Dallas, actually. I was born in Corpus Christi, which is down on the coast.
Hmm.
And so the Italians think that it's pretty hilarious though when because every time you go someplace, they'll ask you, your codice fiscale, your fiscal code, and where you're born, because that's how they figure out, how it's based on your birthplace and
Hmm.
your name and your birth date. And so they always say, well, where were you born? And I say, Corpus Christi,
The
Texas. And
body
they're
of
like,
Christ.
yeah, so they find it quite hilarious. But we moved away from there when I was little bitty, and so I grew up in Dallas, so I'm really a Dallasite.
Hmm.
Um, but I've spent so much time in Houston because I spent so many years going back and back and back to Houston Grand Opera. And we actually have my whole family has a bunch of family there. My aunts, my cousins are there. My great aunt lived there. My great uncle lived there. So I have lots of family. So I've spent a lot of time in Houston, even just on vacations and stuff.
Hmm.
So I know Houston quite well and love it too, even though there's always this kind of um,
Rivalry.
rivalry between Dallas and Houston. Yeah,
Now,
they're very different.
Dallas seems to have a rivalry with everyone.
Yeah,
In
I
that
think
rivalry
Dallas has a
with
little bit of a chip on its shoulder because we're not as cultural as this, and we're not as this, and we're not, and Dallas is very, very, very how would I say this delicately? Very conscious of social mobility, and we I find that Dallas, a lot of times there can be a lot more oh, what is the word? My brain in English sometimes goes out the window, and it
I
sounds
understand.
it
Say it in
sounds really
Italian.
stupid. Well, and it doesn't even come sometimes in any language at this
Right.
point. But Dallas a lot of times tends to have at least the reputation of being more flash than substance.
Hmm.
And so you can find that sometimes in or used to be able to find that a lot in the cultural scene, which I think the cultural scene has become a bit more real in the past couple of decades.
What do you mean by real?
Well, I felt like you had the great Callis years at Dallas Opera, and then Dallas Opera was kind of, all of the people who couldn't really sing anymore would come there, and you'd trot them out, and people would come and they'd get all dressed up, and they had no idea what they're looking at, and they really didn't care. And, I mean, this is my take on it, of course. So
Hmm.
I'm growing up during that period, pretty much.
Yeah.
I saw who did I see? Did I see Sutherland or I'm trying to think if it was Beverly Sills or Sutherland, because it was like one of my idols, and my brain's gone now.
Both
Uh,
sang there.
yeah, but I'm not sure while I was in high school. Anyhow, there were a few, far and few during that time, great voices that came to Dallas, I think.
Hmm.
So it if the I'm being mean, of course. If the Dallas audiences appreciated it, I think there were some really hardcore fans, and then you had a bunch of people that went there just to dress up, just to have an excuse to dress up, and so we kind of bear that reputation still down the road, even though I think that the cultural scene has really gotten a lot better and less status conscious. That's the main
Right.
part of it.
Right.
So and I grew up right in the middle of like the most status conscious part of Dallas too.
Hmm.
So and then I went to college there as well. So
SMU.
yeah, I went to SMU. Yeah, I'm from
Okay.
Highland Park, and then I
Right.
went to SMU after that. So and then after that, after I graduated, well, actually before I graduated, I went to San Francisco to the Maryland program.
Well,
In
before we
between.
do that, I want to give listeners my take on
Ah,
Dallas because it'll
okay.
contrast with yours as a native New Yorker.
Okay. That's
Because I was
interesting.
born in Manhattan and grew up with our theaters, the New York Philharmonic, Metropolitan Opera, Carnegie Hall, and all of that, and Broadway. Um, I was always very aware of two cities that felt very competitive with New York, Dallas and Atlanta. Both
Really?
of them wanted the status of New York, and if New York had something, Dallas or Atlanta wanted to better it.
Hmm.
Interestingly, the city down the road, Fort Worth,
Mm.
often outdid Dallas in
Well,
acquiring something. So, for
yeah,
example, they have this wonderful museum in Fort Worth, the Kimball
the
Museum.
Kimball. Yeah, I was about to say.
And a few years ago, a Michelangelo painting was discovered, and it was brought to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York to be restored and cleaned and then put on exhibition. And after that, it would be sold to the highest bidder.
Mm,
And there are not many Michelangelo paintings that are not on walls and ceilings.
yeah,
And those few that are in Florence, they're in London, and you
Milan.
really want that.
Yeah.
And somehow New Yorkers, there's a lot of money in New York, could not get it together to defeat the Kimball. So the one Michelangelo painting in the United States hangs in Fort Worth, Texas. And bravo to them for having the understanding. I think they paid $76 million of what that means. And,
Wow.
and
Who
that,
was that?
frankly,
Was that one family? Was that the Basses?
I don't know if it was the Basses or the Kimball or how they organized it.
Okay.
Listeners should know that the Bass family of Fort Worth is very wealthy. They funded a very beautiful theater called Bass Hall that was designed and built by a friend of mine. So I
Hmm.
went to the opening of Bass Hall. It's a
Cool.
wonderful theater.
Yeah.
And as I said, apart from Houston that I don't know, my experience of Texas is that Texans like to build big institutions,
Mhm.
whether they're universities or the biggest churches around
Yeah.
or performing arts centers.
Yeah.
And so Dallas has built a rather showy but rather wonderful opera house. They have a
Mhm.
wonderful concert hall. They have, in effect, built an arts district in
Yeah.
downtown Dallas. Um, Before the pandemic really hit, I was in London when the pandemic did hit, and I came quickly home. I was working at the Covent
Mhm.
Garden. But
Um,
my job before that, I was in Dallas at
mm.
the Symphony. It was sort of February 2nd of 2020.
Yeah.
And they were doing a concert version of Salome, Fabio Luisi conducting.
Mm.
And it was fantastic.
Mm.
And that I went on the Sunday afternoon. There were two performances. And that evening was the Super Bowl, and the Dallas Cowboys were not playing in the Super Bowl. So
Okay.
therefore, the city was not invested in it that way. But all the restaurants except for one were closed because all the Dallasites were home watching the Super Bowl. It
Mm.
was enough early that we knew of the pandemic, but it hadn't really bitten the United States yet.
Ah.
And but I had dinner with Fabio Luisi, the
Mm.
conductor. Now, what this also points to is Dallas has, and Atlanta more recently, but Dallas for a long time, has had the sense, the wherewithal, whatever, to bring in Maria Callas first, with John Vickers singing with her,
Yeah.
1957.
Yeah.
Um, Rather remarkable that she would come that early in Dallas's musical life. I
Yeah.
should
True.
say, too, that the
That was
Metropolitan Opera
quite
for many
honest.
years until 1986 toured, and one of the tour cities was Dallas, another was Atlanta.
Yeah.
And for the most part, opera companies didn't flourish in cities where the Met toured,
Hmm.
or they came later.
Yeah.
Dallas was among the first in 1957 to build, and the Dallas Symphony is there for a long time.
Yeah. That was
And
Plato Carianis. That was mainly what that was his legacy was Callas and all of that. You
right.
know,
Well,
I think after he left, that there was kind of a period
yeah,
when
but the thing is, the
when I
Dallas
started getting
Opera,
interested in opera, and so that's why my picture of Dallas and the cultural scene is kind of me, because when I was actually starting to pay attention to all of that,
right,
it wasn't so great. And then it picked up again after I got out of college, basically,
right.
and really picked up because they got the new halls and new just new fresh air and into
No, I
both
know.
the symphony
I
and
want to add one more thing, Laura, before we then
yeah.
take you to San Francisco. Um, in my experience in Dallas, and I've lectured there a lot. I brought in a lot. I lectured at the Art Museum in the 1980s and have been going back to Dallas ever since.
Wow.
Um, and Dallas and Victoria, British Columbia have something in common for me. They have the best used bookstores I've been to in the United States
Really?
in terms of what I'm looking for. And I think the reason for Dallas is that it was a tradition in many homes in Dallas. You were talking about the striving, the sense of wanting to look like you were cultured, that
Status.
many homes built beautiful collections of books back when people actually read books. And when these people died or their children didn't want all the books, they wound up in used bookstores.
Hmm.
And one time I was in Dallas in the 90s, and apparently someone died who loved Wagner. And
Oh,
I went to a used bookstore and bought about 50 Wagner books that I shipped
oh
back
my
to New York
Lord.
because that person gathered it. And it was not a one-time thing. Whenever I go to Dallas, I
Mhm.
go to used bookshops and I find real treasures that apparently people kept in their homes. Victoria, British Columbia, Powell's in Portland, Oregon,
Yeah.
the Tattered Page in Denver. There are certain other stores like that, but nothing like the density I found in Dallas for great used books.
Where do you go?
I don't remember their names, but
Okay. I was just
I
curious.
I relate them usually to pastries and donut shops. If someone sends me to that, then nearby is there a
Then
bookstore?
you know. Yeah.
But I seem to remember there's a hotel called the Magnolia.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so near the Magnolia Hotel
Okay,
were a
now
few.
go
Yeah,
on. Yeah.
right. So anyway, it's a city that has had a great deal of acquired culture, and I
Yeah.
think that acquired culture is not the same as rooted culture.
But I think it can be commended because that
Yes.
means
Oh,
you
definitely.
want to, you know?
Definitely.
Yeah.
There's a sense that to be a great city, you have to have culture. And I
Mhm.
deeply respect that about Dallas and other Texas cities I've been to, and
Mhm.
apparently Houston as well, because Texans could use their money for other things, and they
Yeah.
do,
Yeah.
but they also really, really invest in culture. And I
Mhm.
think that runs counter to the stereotype.
That's true. That's very true. I mean, you think we always called Fort Worth Cowtown,
Yeah,
and Fort Worth is this little gem right next to Dallas.
yeah.
It's I mean it's its own thing. It's got its own character. You have the stockyards. It's very typically Texan, and it feels very much more Wild West and that sort of
Hmm.
thing. And Dallas is kind of refined, and we
Yeah.
have the
Neiman Marcus.
yeah. I've spent much of my life at Neiman Marcus.
Yeah.
Um, but but all that said, you have the Kimball, you have so much culture, and it almost feels. I mean, this is me saying again, more real in Fort Worth,
Hmm.
and maybe more typical. I don't know than what you would expect in Texas,
True.
but also there's I feel like there is more kind of what we call old money in Fort Worth than in
Yeah.
Dallas.
Yeah.
And Dallas, I think, has always felt a little bit like, oh, we're we'd like to feel like we're old money, but we're new money.
Right.
And that's what my dad's an architect,
Yeah.
and dad we would go down some of these streets in Highland Park that just beautiful old houses, but my dad would be like, up, instant old, instant old, instant old, because they'd have this oldie style houses trying to look like, oh, we've been here a while. Well, we haven't
Yeah.
been over here a while. There's nothing wrong with that either.
I'm
So
going to tell you another Texas story that just should be documented for opera history. Um, when I worked at the Metropolitan Opera, the single biggest funder by far was a woman named Sybil Harrington, Mrs. Donald Harrington.
mhm.
And she was tiny, but she had high Texan hair. Half of her height was her hair. It was white and always somehow in a dome,
Yeah.
and she was lovely. She was really a genuinely nice person who they named the auditorium for her at the Met, but she was very discreet, so
Mhm.
that she just wanted a little plaque on one wall, not her name emblazoned.
Yeah.
Whereas Mercedes Bass, for whom the Grand Tier was named, and she's a Bass from, or a former Bass from Fort Worth, her name is in massive letters. No
Ah.
complaints either. But um, at the Met, two of our biggest funders were from Dallas, not from Dallas, from Fort Worth,
Mhm.
and Sybil Harrington. I forget which town she was from. It
I
was
don't.
in the northern part of the state where
Okay.
there's a lot of oil, maybe Abilene.
Ah. Okay.
And you were supposed to be nice to her, obviously, at the Met, but she genuinely was lovely
Hmm.
and no pretense.
Yeah.
And she spoke in a very thick Texan accent. And um, one time I said to her, I was taking her somewhere in the theater, and I said, "Thank you, Mrs. Harrington, for everything that you've done for the Met, because we're able to do a lot of the things we do because of you." And she said, and forgive my imitation, "Well, don't thank me, thank Earl." And I said, "Is Earl your husband?" I thought it was Donald Harrington. "No, honey, Earl." And I said, "I'm sorry, I don't know who Earl is." She said, "It's black stuff. It comes out of the ground.
Ah, thank Earl. Thank Earl.
Oil."
Yeah. Thank Earl.
And
Well, it's funny
frankly,
when I'm dictating on my phone. Anytime I say sing, SING, it writes out saying,
really.
SAYING.
Hmm.
Is my accent that bad after 30 years gone? Sorry.
So anyway, that's our Texas coverage. And it is, I want people to know that they may feel competitive with us. We in New York don't feel competitive with them,
Of course not.
but nonetheless, we acknowledge. I mean,
Hey, but Texas is bigger than France.
Texas is bigger than France, and
Hmm.
I know, but I just don't want people to accept either the stereotypes of Texas or New York, for that matter,
No, of
because
course not.
both places are a lot more complicated and rich, culturally rich,
Tis true.
and can be compassionate, can be. You then moved to San Francisco to the Maryland program. One of my forthcoming guests will be the person who is now retiring as director of the Maryland program,
Ah,
Gene Kellogg.
Oh,
And but I decided I wanted a couple of people on this year who talk about the phenomenon of the Merrill program.
mm.
Jean as the person who ran it, and you as someone who really flourished there, I think.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Well,
Mhm.
I went out, I did Marilla, which is the summer program. I did that between my junior and senior year in high school, in college, excuse me, not that early. I was young, but not that young. Um, and it changed my life. I mean, it really was, it was opera boot camp, and everybody was at least like 24, 25, and here I was, just I wasn't even legal yet. Um, so I went back and finished up my last year at SMU and made my professional debut actually during the semester, because I had won, or I don't even know if I won it, or the Shreveport Opera competition.
Mhm.
And my prize, or whatever they gave me, was that I got to do Adele and Die Fledermaus in their season.
Mhm.
So I did that, took off a month from school and both faculties, because I had two majors. I was a foreign language major and also a music major. They both let me off for an entire month to
Mhm.
go do that. So it's kudos to them. So did that and then went back after I graduated to Maryland again, and it just was so incredible. Laffy Mansouri was the general director of San Francisco Opera at that point, and Christine Bullen was the director of the program at the time. She eventually became the director of the Young Artist Program at the Paris Opera.
Yep.
It started that up with Ugal, and then after that came back to San Francisco and was a director of Chanticleer until just recently when she retired.
Let
So
me ask you one thing.
yeah,
Could we be talking approximately 1993?
1993. Yeah, I was 19. I was there 1990 to 94. So
Okay.
yeah.
So this answers the question, where did I first hear Laura Claycomb?
Oh, really?
It
Oh,
was
okay.
1993 because I was hired by Christine
Hmm.
for the first, this was my first job at San Francisco Opera, was 1993, to work teaching, coaching, and so on.
Okay.
And we also went on a cruise in March of 1993 on a Cunard ship in the Caribbean
With Regina Resnick.
with Regina Resnick
Yes,
and
and
Fred Plotkin
Arvis.
and Christine Bullen. So
Yes, and Arvis and her
that's
husband
where,
Arvis.
okay.
Okay, because I knew you, and I was like, why do I know him? And we worked together though, not just there, but also I can't remember. Did you do Candide in at Opera Pacific?
No,
Okay.
no.
Then you did uh the what's it called? Um the the student prince at New York City Opera?
I was tangential to that. We won't say that I
Okay, you
did
were
that.
around there because I
I was
know
definitely around. I did not
okay,
do that, but I
okay.
was involved in
But
the
you were
production.
there.
Yeah.
I think you were
Right.
around because I remembered you from, like, I couldn't remember what it was. And
Yeah.
I know Fred, but why?
But
Um
actually, now, I mean, I kind of thought that I met you in San Francisco, but I actually met you on the Cunard Vista Fjord in the Caribbean when there were terrible blizzards in the United States, in
I didn't remember that.
at least in the Northeast. And we were in this gorgeous weather off the coast of Venezuela and Curacao and Aruba and so on. And I was teaching, Regina Resnick was teaching, Christine was leading and managing,
Mhm.
and you were one of the artists.
Yeah, Kathy
That's
Cook
who.
was on that.
Yep,
Eli Villanueva. I was trying to think
yep.
who else. Jill. Trying to
Grove.
remember. No, her last name's Lord now, and I can't think of what her maiden name is. Like, because you would know her from her maiden name. She's married to Matt Lord. Jill, what the heck was her maiden name? Oh gosh. Anyhow,
And
um,
also lovely Carol Chickering and her husband, who's Bill
Bill
Burton,
Burr.
I think. Yeah.
Okay, That well,
They
wait,
were
no, that was probably another one because I don't think Bill was
okay.
on this
All
with me.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. But
But
anyway,
I've got more
I
than
just
one
want to
patronage.
establish where I first heard you because
Yeah.
I had a sense it went back that far to 93.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
So
San
more than 30
Francisco,
years. Yeah.
yeah, good Lord.
Yep.
Well, so San Francisco is where I kind of discovered that I mean, I knew I had high notes and I knew that I could get up there and whatnot, but to do like really coloratura stuff was Marilla for me. Going up every night into the chorus room and just practicing on my own.
How
And
was that discovered and unleashed?
well, I studied with Barbara Hill Moore at SMU, and people say, "Oh, you were just a natural talent." Well, haha. No, I was looking through some old things, and I had made a recording with my church choir director because I was the star of the choir when I was like 14, 15. And that's what allowed me let my parents know that I actually had some kind of voice to start taking lessons. So I did a recording of this piece that our choir director, Alan Pote, had written. And we'd done it on tour. We'd done a little tour of this little play called A Season to Celebrate. And my big solo was the solo at the end of the whole thing. And every time I sang, everybody would start crying. And my parents thought I had some little dinky solo, and they showed up with some friends like, oh, it's going to be boring. And they're passing the Kleenex down the aisle, you know. So I had this recording, and then I had a recording about, I think, 2, maybe 3 years later when I had been studying with Barbara. And Barbara, when I started with her, I was, Galilee man, where are you going? And and so I had this kind of nice clear top that would pop out while I was thinking that I was a mezzo. So, because I thought it was very interesting to be a mezzo or a contralto. And so Barbara had me in the middle, 24 arias and songs, Italian arias. And then after like a few months said, Laura, I think you need to go buy the high version. And I said, oh, why? And she said, because you're a soprano. And I go, okay. I haven't got the thing. But I started off actually quite kind of dark sound. And within 3 years, I'd say, like when I finished high school, maybe it was 3 years, probably. When I finished high school, I have a recording of myself singing, I think, like Anon Credea or something like that. And I played both of them for a friend of mine who knows me very well,
From
who's also
Sonambula.
Sonambula, yeah.
Yeah.
And so played the first one for her, and she's like, who's that? I'm like, that was me. And she's like, oh, really? Wow. And then I played the Sonambula for her, which was like senior in high school, seriously. And she said, oh, that's you. When was that? She thought it was a professional thing. And I said, no, that was the end of high school. And she went, what? so I was like, whoa, okay. And so my teacher actually did wonderful things for me, but she never wanted to work on the top notes with me because she was kind of afraid that I was going to be hammering around in the very, very, very tip top, what they call sovracuti, which is like above a high C, C sharp, D. So once you get up into like D, E flat, E, F, those are what the Italians call sovracuti, or over high notes, super high notes. And I just didn't quite know what I needed to do up there. And so I was studying Rigoletto. I was studying Gilda in order to do, supposedly, either to do or to cover, which I ended up covering, Merola, the Rigoletto that we were going to do there the next summer. And so my teacher said, well, why don't you go study this with Tommy Hayward, who also taught at SMU? And so I went and studied that with him. I actually ran through the whole thing with Donnie Ray Albert, who was also studying with him. He was way out of school. He was already a professional and whatnot, but he was working on Rigoletto. And so Tommy said, oh, why don't you come on, sing with this young girl? And so he gave me all these new exercises, a lot of Seth Riggs exercises, actually, which was a lot of lip trills, which I'd never done.
What are Seth Riggs exercises? I don't know that.
Seth Riggs is a big LA guy who was very, very, I'd say, influential in not just classical singing technique stuff, but also he has a book like Singing for the Stars and that sort of thing, but also with all of the pop singers.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a technique that you could use in all sorts of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways to access the top were lip trills, which weren't really the thing. Nowadays we go or is totally standard way to warm up. These what we call semi-occluded, so halfway occluded exercises where you're stopping the air some so you feel the air pressure and how much you can kind of gauge how much air pressure you want to give. And it also keeps, if you can bubble your lips, that means you're giving enough flow to help the vocal cords come together, to call them together instead of smashing them. So anyhow, gave me these new exercises, which I would go up and practice once I got to Maryland and tried to do, high notes and stuff. And then I ended up doing a master class. My first, big blasted high notes and stuff was with Lotfi Mansouri in a master class. I did Lakme from the big bell, the Air des Clochettes. And so found out, I can sustain these and have kind of a nice quality up there without just kind of touching them, So that was very, very, very kind of breakthrough, interesting for me, for Maryla. And then I didn't know whether I wanted to go to grad school or not, and auditioned. This was weird. I auditioned at Juilliard for the for a master's or the artist thing that they had at the time. I think it's changed in the meantime. And I waited around and went and looked at the callbacks for the next round, and I sang really well, and I knew that I was did well, and my name wasn't on the list. And so I went and I made sure it was the right list and checked on it, and I went on the list, and I thought, okay, I didn't even make callbacks. That's weird. Well, is everybody really that much better than me here? And years later, I got a letter, an official letter from Juilliard saying, since you did not show up for your audition, we will be taking your files out of our files. So I was like,
wow.
Okay. So I don't know what happened. If I was so unmemorable that they just didn't realize that I did my audition. If, some kind of weird kerfluffle happened, or if I was on the list and I didn't show up to the second audition, I don't know. And it still kind of bugs me to this day that I don't know what the heck happened. Because the course of my life could have changed so differently.
Sure.
Because I never had much of a New York presence.
Working life, yeah.
No, because I never lived. I'm one of the few who never lived in New York. Never. I mean, I performed at City Opera. I've never sung at the Met. Well, Jonathan Friend doesn't like me, so that kind of, killed that for me. But and he's still there, darn it. So anyhow, it can't be everybody's taste. But I never kind of got the kind of New York thing going, and stayed in San Francisco. Ended up doing an Adler Fellowship, so an apprenticeship at the opera.
Right. And so just so people know, Maryla is sort of a young artist program. Adler is the next step up.
Is the next step up. It's where you're there year round, and you train, you do coachings every day, and you do small roles in the operas, and you cover or you double the big roles and some of the medium roles too. And sometimes you get to go on. I went on for the first show I did, actually. So yeah, so I ended up doing that for 3 years. Ended up being there 4 years. I was freelance 1 year once I came out of the Adler Fellowship. And so that really formed me because I was looking back at some of the casts. They were amazing. I mean, the cast that I covered and performed with, I was like, oh my God. My very first show there was Suor Angelica, and I was the novice,
Mm-hmm.
which has like, 2 lines maybe. And I covered Suor Genoviefa, which
Mm-hmm.
was oh my Janet Williams.
Mm-hmm.
And our Suor Angelica was Leonie Mitchell, who
Wow.
was a
Yeah.
fantastic. She would
Yeah.
show up just dressed to, she just looked so
Sure.
elegant, pretty, and then she'd throw herself on the floor in these gorgeous clothes, be like,
Mm-hmm.
ah. And it was John Copley directing, and the Principessa was Elena Obrazova.
Wow.
I know, I
Wow.
know, and yeah, it's just amazing. And one of the last show I did was Dangerous Liaisons in
Mm-hmm.
'94. And that show was Tom Hampson, Renee, before she was
Renee
Renee,
Fleming.
before
Yep.
anybody really knew who Renee was, and Mary Mills, who's a dear friend of mine. Trying to think who else was in it. My brain's gone. Betsy Bishop, Elizabeth
Mm-hmm.
Bishop, Tom Hampson.
Mm-hmm.
It was an amazing, beautiful opera as well. And yeah, so I mean, just the people that I got to work with during all that time was just, I go back and I look and I think, oh my goodness, even in like smaller roles, you find these people that have made, these
Big
huge,
careers.
yeah.
It's
So,
interesting. Tom Hampson is a friend of mine. And when I
mm,
began the show in April of 2020, he was my very first guest.
nice.
And he and Renee Fleming have done many things through the years together, which is
Mhm.
a great thing to think about as sort of an artistic partnership. But the
Yeah.
last thing they did together, which I'm sorry I never got to see, was in Paris Opera. They did Nixon
Oh,
in
they just did Nick
China
this last
as
year.
Richard Nixon and Pat Nixon,
Yeah, that's pretty
going
cool.
from dangerous liaisons to the Nixons.
True. Too funny. Wow. Yeah. So yeah,
um,
so my
yeah.
time there was fantastic. That was just such a formative thing. I worked with everybody and their dog. I worked with I remember I worked with Hans Hotter 1 year,
Wow.
and
I mean,
Hans
I know who that is. Explain who the great Hans Hotter
the great
Wotan.
Hans Hotter,
Yeah. Wow.
well, just very, very, very well known and very well respected bass
Mhm.
who made a huge career and was a wonderful pedagogue. He he had me. I remember I was singing Pamina, a role which I actually never did, but I was singing Pamina for him, and I got up to the top, and I would kind of float that up there. And he was like, no, 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 you have to sing that with your voice. And I was like, hmm. So okay, you know, and and he said, no, no, and he kept kind of insisting, and I couldn't do what he wanted me to do, and I thought he was a total a-hole. Thought, why does he want me to scream that up there? And then years later, I was on this cruise with Regina Resnick, and we were working with her in front of an audience, and so she was like, Laura, and so I was doing Pamina again, and so I get up to, and she was like, no, I want you to give me the quality of your voice all the way up there without going off of the voice. And I was like, oh, that was what Hans Hotter wanted me to do. And I thought he was a mean person for hammering at me to try to get me to do it. But I, at that time, had not been, I wasn't capable of doing it yet. And so with time and kind of getting a little bit more in my body and whatnot, I could finally do it. And when she said it, it just clicked. So it was very interesting for me as kind of a pedagogue later to think about those two moments and realize that sometimes, students are not going to be able to do blah, blah, blah. But what you plant the seed for doing, somebody else may unlock that, and
Mhm.
and and that seed may finally bloom. Where was I going with this?
We were talking about Hans Hotter,
What
and
about
actually,
people?
I'd like to interject about Hans Hotter.
Ah,
Hotter. I want listeners to go to Idagio and listen to
please,
Hans Hotter.
please,
He
please.
he was influential in forming James Morris's magnificent interpretation of Wotan,
Oh,
and
wow.
he was a great teacher
Yeah, he was
and
a fantastic teacher.
singer. But not every great singer is a great teacher. We're going to get
True.
to that later.
Well, I
But
also was able to study with Regine Crispin,
okay,
who
well let's hold that because Regina is
in
someone I've
San
covered on the show, and I want to talk about her because I adored her. But the thing is that Hans Hotter we can
Francisco.
find on old recordings from Bayreuth, some
Yeah.
of which he did with Regina Resnick. That's why
Oh,
I'm mentioning this,
yeah,
because chances are Regina, who was a very intelligent,
strong
attuned
woman.
person, probably picked that up from Hans Hotter and it got passed on to you. This is
True.
how this works, that
Yeah.
you never know when the planted seed will suddenly sprout years later and
Yeah.
how. And you're a very good example of that, that it took two admonitions to
Yeah.
get you to understand what they were saying.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
it doesn't mean that Hans Hotter didn't know how to tell me. It's I wasn't receptive to
yeah,
whatever he was going to tell me because I wasn't able to do it physically yet.
yeah.
So that was very interesting for me. I also studied, I was going to say, I studied with Regine Crispin, who was a huge, huge inspiration, I would say, and mentor to me because I worked with her many years later. Anytime I do anything French, I took it to Regine when she would be coming through New York, and my daughter the regiment is because of her.
Hmm.
All of my French repertoire. I mean, if you I can't hear any of the Les Nudités and not think of her. That
Yeah.
haunting sound, and always the admonition of "Breathe, darling," and she would put her hands on you, and all of a sudden you had like 5 lungs. You could just all of a
Hmm.
sudden breathe, and the main thing that I learned from her was just kind of this, in French at least, this openness. And she said, "What is this?" Because the ending, like we in English, we have the silent e at the end. In French, they have this silent e, but it's not actually. It's a little bit pronounced, but it's mainly kind of an And a lot of people, in trying to sound more French, make it really closed, and they'd say pleure instead of pleure, and she'd be like, "What is this?" So she taught me to pronounce the French a bit more Italianate, so that
Hmm.
all of the vowels stayed in the same space. And she had a beautiful French. Of course, she is French, but
Yeah.
she
But
had
not
such
every person
beautiful.
in their native language speaks beautifully. Yeah,
True, true.
she did.
And she was just wonderful. But I always heard from people that I think she taught at the Conservatoire in Paris, that as a teacher of technique, she didn't really pass on her technique to them, but was a great coach.
Yeah.
So I mean,
So
sometimes
explain the difference, very important, between teacher
mm,
and coach. I do coaching, I don't do teaching.
well,
Well, I mean, I teach
teaching,
audiences, but I don't teach singers. Yeah.
yeah, well, singing is, you have to know not only how the voice works, not just how your voice works, but how the voice works, um, and have a really great idea of not just one technique, but a lot of techniques in order to give this is a teacher. I mean, to give someone different techniques to be able to surmount whatever kind of technical problems they have, because every voice has a technical problem, even if they come to you fresh. um, an oboist will start with a new oboist who is just starting the instrument, and they have a fresh, clean slate. With a singer, you do not, because we use our voices daily to speak. And
Hmm.
if they're going to be singing, then they have already sung something. So they have muscle memory of how they already sing and already speak. And so you have to, I doubt if anybody comes to you with a perfect natural voice. Even if they come to you with a perfect natural voice, you have to teach them what they are doing to make that perfect voice, because it's not always going to be perfect. I think it was Marilyn Horne who said, yeah, you're going to have 3 days during your career. I don't remember how many days she said. 3 days during your career when you're going to be 100% and your voice is going to be fantastic. And those are the 3 days you're not going to be singing anything. You don't have any gig those days. So you have to know, technically what you're doing in order to surmount any problems that come up, because they will, and to correct any intrinsic problems that you have, or problems that you have with your voice. And that's what a teacher does. But a coach will look more on the outside of what things, like the musicality of what you're doing. And also a teacher will do this, but it's, I think their main job is to get the technical house in order so that people can do the musical things, the dynamics, the language, the interpretation, the body, and whatever. My teacher, my very first teacher, Barbara Hill Moore, really formed me, because I came in like making really pretty sounds, and then she got me singing really beautiful sounds, but I was still just kind of standing there. And I'd win NATS, National Association of Teachers Singing. I won all the competitions, and yet all of my stuff said, "Oh, just gorgeous singing, but a little bit disinterested," something like that on all of. And so I knew I needed to work on acting, and she really helped me kind of put myself together. And then I knew that I needed to work more on my acting, and so I took acting every semester when I was in college and stuff, and did intensive acting courses with a guy named Sabin Epstein from ACT, from American Conservatory Theater, and with Ethel Evans, the famous Ethel Evans from San Francisco Opera, on just technique. So like, keep your eyes steady, look there, move your eye then, and taught me how to like walk across the stage, which I had no idea how to do.
How do you walk across the stage?
Well, I think many people who don't who don't have already the dramatic animal in them have to learn technique, and it is something you can learn. You walk with your upstage foot. You start with your upstage foot, so you're not crossing over yourself because if you're the audience, why do I want to cross if I'm going that way, why do I need to start with my left foot, my downstage foot? So you start with your upstage foot so that you're open to the audience at all points. So, just stupid stuff like that. And I can still hear her sometimes when I'm looking at other artists, but with myself especially. And Ethel would say, "Darling, what's so interesting on the floor?" Because you'd be thinking that you're all so in the moment, and you'd be looking down and singing, and nobody can receive your emotion if you're thinking and emoting to the floor. And she was the one who taught me that, and it felt very fake in the beginning. Yep. But if I sing, and then I go, you're going to hear the second one twice as loud, because my eyes are up and you can see my eyes. And it's crazy, but it's true. And so all of these sorts of things I just soaked up because I knew I needed them in San Francisco. And I got to work with Antonino Tonini as well, who was Maria Callas's big coach when she came to La Scala. And I got to work on, I think I worked on Gilda and Lucia with him. So as a 21-year-old or something, 20 or 21, I can't remember. And so I had so many opportunities to work with these amazing people there. I remember one I don't remember if it's when I was an Adler or and already thinking, oh, I am, I kind of know what I'm doing. And it was during the summer. So there were a bunch of Merillini. They called the people who do Merillini. So I think I was already an Adler fellow. And I heard somebody warming up at the end of the hall. I thought, oh, what a beautiful lyric voice. And they were doing Capriccio at the same time. And so I was listening. I thought, oh, that's a really good Merillini. The door opens and it's Kiri Takanoa.
Ah.
Needless to say, I didn't go, oh, I didn't say anything. I was like,
And was she doing Capriccio or?
yeah,
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I saw that
yeah.
performance there. Yeah.
Like 500, she had like, I think she had two different prompters. One to be like, go that way. And another one to give her all the words and stuff. But she was just beautiful.
Oh yeah.
What a sound.
Um,
So amazing times in San Francisco. That was just.
I just want to say a couple of things and then ask you another question. The first thing I want to say is for people want to know more about Regine Crespin, Crespin. I did a show about her in the summer of 2023 with Isabelle Masset, Masset, who was a protege, not a singer, but a managerial and a cultural protege of Regine Crespin. And she really told a lot of very wonderful stories about Crespin.
Wow. Isabel's
I
great.
got to work with Crespin, and the thing that she taught me, among many things, was she always said, "Il faut vivre la langue." In other words, you have to live the language of whatever language it was. And the character that she did, if she did Dialogue of the Carmelites in English, she lived that English text more than anyone else in the cast. And even if you had native English speakers, the most lived in English was hers.
Wow.
And it was always a remarkable thing. Her Wagnerian German, her Toscas in Italian, of course.
Wow.
She brought a whole linguistic dimension to her performances, in addition to the gorgeous singing and the acting.
Wow. I never got to see her perform on stage.
Oh, yeah.
She had already stopped by the time she was teaching at Marilla.
Yeah. I was
And
lucky that, I'm not a performer. I've been on stage a few times in little roles or as a corpse once in Johnny's Kiki, but I got to be on the stage, backstage with these artists and work with them and attend their rehearsals and learn from them and occasionally help them with things. And so, but she was really, 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 really special. And I just have to add, you mentioned Elena Obraztsova, the
yeah, she
sexiest
just
opera
passed
singer,
away.
the sexiest opera singer who ever lived.
Oh, really? Oh, how funny,
Wow.
because I only knew her later.
Oh
When she
boy.
did Pesa, yeah, the voice was a bit broken by that point, but it was so loud and just so present and just
Yeah.
so authoritative. Oh my God, she came out on stage and we were all scared shitless. Can I
Yeah.
say that? Sorry.
You
Um,
sure?
she came out and I think she took chest voice up to about a B flat or so,
Yep. Yep.
and it was crazy. About up, and it was like, oh my
But
God.
she
Not that
also
it was
had this.
ugly. It was not ugly. It was just all balls out. It was amazing.
But the thing about her was, there are people who can act sexy, as Carmen, as Emily, things like that.
And
And
she
then
didn't.
there are these very few people who are sexy. And she
Mm,
was that.
wow.
She didn't have to act sexy.
Huh.
Other people, Grace Bumbry had a sexiness about her, certainly. Shirley Verrett in a very different way, but more of a formality, an imposing, glorious formality. But not what Obraztsova was in terms of just being a natural sex bomb. And not she was pretty, but she was not that she was the prettiest, but it
But
wasn't that. It was
yeah.
something else.
Huh.
And it
Interesting.
was just, men and women, gay, straight, whatever, would all swoon in her presence because there was just something going
She
on.
had so
I
much
met and I once worked with Sophia Loren, and Sophia Loren is gorgeous and has some of that. But I will say that in terms of pure animal magnetism, Eleanor Obraztsova was just in
Wow.
a class of her own. And it was
Wow.
quite something on the stage, because she would do something like Santuzza, who was not necessarily a sexy character, but one driven by sex
Yeah.
and by the absence of sex at a certain point. And, wowie. She
Wow.
never, Obrantova never had to put that on.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
it was quite something, and it was just a gift and part of her natural makeup. But I never get to talk about Eleanor Obrantova
Uh,
enough.
well,
But she was,
I mean, I didn't know her as a performer so much because when you're in a show with somebody, a lot of times you don't get to see them
yeah,
do their stuff. I mean, we actually got to see her do that because it's such a, that big scene when the Principessa comes in. But she also judged me in 1994, and she was the head of the jury for the Tchaikovsky competition.
in Moscow.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
let's
which
talk about Russia, which is, in our world right now, it's not everybody's favorite place, but it
I
has a glorious, glorious cultural tradition. Part
oh
of
my
my family is from there.
oh
Um, and, the Russians are, many of them are steeped in grand culture of all kinds, no matter
yeah.
what their
Oh,
financial
I
class.
totally agree. Well, I went there in '94 for
Yeah,
the Tchaikovsky competition, and I kind of knew I wouldn't win because the last time they had done it, it was Debbie Voigt who had won. So they wouldn't give it to an American again. But, I did my best and I got the silver medal. But I was so struck because this was really the wild west of perestroika at this point.
yeah.
I was struck by the audiences because they were not at all impressed with flash and they knew what they were listening to. They knew their culture. They knew their songs. They knew Tchaikovsky because you had to do a Tchaikovsky or Rachmaninoff song on there, and they knew those. There was one gal who came in. I think she was sick. I don't know what happened, but she sang Queen of the Night, the worst I've ever heard in my life. It was horrible. Um, and I thought, oh, I'll clap because I was out in the audience listening at that point because I'd already sung. It's the first round. And nobody moved. Like they were sitting on their hands like, no way.
Yet.
Yeah. And I was mainly struck by how many book kiosks there were. And
Yes.
so you go by a book kiosk and I could read Cyrillic and I'd be like, it was all the Pushkin,
Hmm.
it wasn't fluffy fluff. It was like real
No,
books and stuff. And people were buying books all the time.
like
And it was their
Dallas.
great literature and they just know their culture so well. It was
Like
just
Dallas, as I said before, but that same thing of there's a segment of the population that takes art and culture very seriously. And
yeah.
we don't necessarily associate that with Dallas, but in
Well,
my experience, it's very much there. And certainly it's very entrenched in Russia.
yeah. Well,
And that's one of the great things there.
um after I got the silver medal, whatever, my career started to take off in Europe. And I think it was about 10 years later, Misha Fichtengoltz called me to come do a concert, like a gala concert, just me with the orchestra, in Moscow, one of the great orchestras there. I forget which one was my first concert there. But people remembered me. They remembered me like nothing 10 years later,
Hmm.
and just welcomed me like, long lost daughter. And I had all these interviews to do. And I have never had such great interviews as I've had in Russia, any place else, because they had these great questions. They had actually studied my my life. They'd studied, what I had done. They'd actually read up on me and done a little bit of research. There was one gal who said, "Yeah, I noticed that you said that your mother stopped doing music when you were about 14 or 15 and became a real estate agent because my mom
Hmm.
was a teacher. She taught piano and she taught music in schools, mainly little kids. So she was getting sick all the time and she was sick of it. And so
Right.
she became a real estate agent so she wouldn't have a cold all the time and make some more money. And so she quit that right about the time when I started to sing and when people noticed that I had a voice. And she said, don't you find that interesting that your mother kind of passed the baton on to you? And
Mm-hmm.
I had never thought about it that way, but she was the one who an interviewer pointed it out to me. And I was
Yeah,
like, oh God, you're right. And so many things like that, they just are so much more, and you don't get the sports guy interviewing you from the newspaper. You get the person who actually knows what La
it does
Sonnambula
art.
is.
Yeah, yeah.
So I did tons of concerts in Moscow over the years, and I also became a consultant for the Bolshoi. So
Mm-hmm.
Misha said, I'm starting up this young artist program at the Bolshoi, and can you consult and help me, decide what I need to do and who I should call, and what do we need to have involved? Because he loved singers. He knew voice. He does know voices, and he's a big Handel expert as
Mm-hmm.
well. So he, trusted me, brought me on to do stuff, and I did master classes with all the young artists. And all of the people that he chose throughout those years that he was there as the director of that program are all making careers, like Venera Gimadeva. Do you know
Mm-hmm.
Venera?
Sure, sure. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, some great voices have come out of that. So, but I'm very proud of the work that I did with all of them, and it kills me now that I'm not able to go back and coach those young artists anymore, because they were so fantastic and just so open to new information from someplace else. And because Russia can be very insular,
Yeah.
as we know now. But I don't think it's going to be, I wonder actually if it will be possible within my lifetime to go back as an American, and not just from our side saying, oh, we need to boycott Russia or whatever. But you forget that the country itself is not democratic, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they vote, but it's not really democratic because you don't have anybody who's allowed to come up in opposition. So, if there's a choice of one person, what kind of democracy is that? And so their government does not represent all the people.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're punishing the whole country now by saying, oh, you can't do anything with the Russians now, at least in Russia,
Yeah.
because they're doing this horrible war in Ukraine. And, so you're kind of stuck saying, oh, I wish I could help those artists still.
It
And I
is
miss
a
my
problem because,
audiences. I miss my
yeah,
audience.
yeah, they're wonderful audiences.
Yeah.
Um, I I've only been to Moscow once. I was there in the communist year in 1979,
Wow.
before when I was a very young man,
Yeah.
before they had the Olympics in 1980. Because
Wow.
there were boycotts and America didn't go in 1980 because of what was going on politically then.
Mm.
But that was my only experience in Moscow, and I never heard an opera there. I saw a ballet there. But I've
Mm.
worked a fair amount in St. Petersburg at the Mariinsky 1 and Mariinsky 2
Oh,
and the
wow.
conservatory. And so my experience is more St. Petersburg, which
Wow.
fashions itself as the old cultural capital
Yeah. Yeah.
and has a rivalry with Moscow.
Of
And,
course.
it's a bit like Milan, Rome, or let's say
Yeah,
instead
it
of
is actually
Milan,
very much like
let
Milan.
I'm going to say Torino, Rome. And transition, I'll tell you why.
Mm.
Because Torino was the first capital of the Republic of Italy. It is the city where La Boheme and Manon Lescaut had their world premieres.
Yeah,
It looks more like Paris and Vienna than it does like Milan or Rome in
true.
terms of its grand boulevards. It
Mm.
has the best chocolate shops in the world. I know you lived in Belgium, but I'll take Torino.
No. I believe no.
Yeah,
I'm right there with you. I lived 10 years in Brussels,
yeah,
and I I know my chocolates here. Yeah,
yeah.
and
They're much better.
gelato here as well.
Gelato, the nocciola, the hazelnut gelato is,
I'm a total snob for
and
gelato
the
now.
cuisine, the slow food movement was founded outside of Torino,
Yeah.
and Italy is from Torino. The Rai Orchestra is based in Torino, Rai being the National Broadcasting Network. The
Mhm.
Teatro Regio, I'm sorry, not Teatro Regio. Yeah, Teatro Regio
Not
of
Teatro.
Torino, was badly bombed. There was a fire as well. And so part of it is the old theater, part of it is the new theater. It has had wonderful highs and occasional lows. I would say that the era with John Andrea Nozeta was a big high. They came to New York and they did Guillaume Tell at
Oh, wow.
Carnegie Hall, and it was named the best musical performance by the New York Times in
Wow.
2014. And and he then went on to Zurich and
Yeah.
National Symphony of Washington. So, um, and they were recording. They were doing lots of recordings back then, and a lot of Anna Netrebko's Italian recordings were Teatro Reggio.
Oh,
Maria Callas was prominent in Torino.
mm.
Um, she directed I Vespri Siciliani as a director in Torino.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Her one big directing job would happen to be in Torino.
Huh.
Um,
Interesting.
and it is a remarkable place. And I've never had a guest on who is an American who lives in Torino.
Mm.
And it's one of my favorite Italian cities. I should say that when the Winter Olympics were done in and near Torino, I
Mhm.
was hired by NBC to do color commentary, not about the sports, but about Torino. Because sometimes,
Oh,
let's
wow.
say there was a snowstorm or fog and they couldn't do an event up in Valle d'Aosta, they would
They go
switch
around.
back to Fred, where are you now? I'm eating chocolate for a change.
Oh,
Or, the Grand
time
Boulevards.
during all that.
Yeah, that was me.
Oh, how
And
fun.
I was a very close friend of Luciano Pavarotti, and that was his last public appearance.
Mm.
And so it's a magnificent city
Yeah.
and just not really understood.
It's
And
totally, totally, totally underrated. Nobody
yeah,
knows this hidden gem, and I kind of like it, sort of,
yeah,
because of that. But people will come through. You have French and Swiss who come through on their way to Milan, and they'll come through and they'll be like, "Oh, what should I see here?" And I'm like, "Well, it's the seat of the Savoy family, so you got, 500,000 castles to look at,
hmm.
and fantastic museums, and the
The
food."
Egyptian Museum is second only to Cairo.
It is not second to Cairo. I will tell you because I've been to both. Um,
Is it
and
better than
Cairo,
Cairo?
it's better than Cairo. Yeah, hell yeah.
I think the
It's so much better.
display is better in Torino.
Yeah, there's just a bunch of stuff kind of thrown there in Cairo. I mean, I was there before the whole, kerfluffle,
Right.
and it's probably gotten even worse, I would say, since the Egyptian uprising. But uh but yeah, the whole setup is beautiful.
It was
And
recently redone because before that it was a bit like Cairo that everything was just sort of
kind of,
in, installed there. But now they've done a beautiful exhibition. I
yeah.
want to say also about the Egyptian Museum in Torino that the Italian Senate, when Italy became a nation, was in Torino, not Rome.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Giuseppe Verdi was a senator for life. And as he was preparing Aida, he spent a great deal of time in the Egyptian Museum
Oh.
looking at musical instruments, looking at imagery, and so on. And when I teach Aida, which I do very often, if I'm in Italy, I take people to the Egyptian Museum and show
Um,
them what Verdi looked at
oh,
and
wow.
how he found inspiration in certain works of art and
Oh,
certain rudimentary musical instruments
funny.
to
Wow.
create the sound and then the sight that he did with the opera Aida.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Huh. Well, it's
yeah.
interesting too. Palazzo Madama, which is the palace in the very center of town, in the main square of Turin, kind of represents all of the history of Turin. And because a lot of times what they would do back in the day was, if you had a wall or something in from medieval times, you would take that apart and use those bricks to make something for your, neoclassical, whatever. Instead, they left everything. So Turin started off as a Roman encampment. And so you have the Quadrilatero Romano, which is a section of town, which was the four-sided
Hmm.
wall part of the city, which was the encampment. And we still have bits and pieces of the wall. And one piece of the wall is under Palazzo Madama, and they left it there. So you can see it still underneath. And then they just built on top of it. And there's a medieval part of the castle. We have two towers that are medieval. And then on the front side, you have the Renaissance facade. So they didn't tear down anything. They just built
They added, yeah.
not even on top of it, but they added to it. And
it's
so
like skins of an onion.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's true.
Totally. And it's interesting because the very first Senate met in Palazzo Madama and of Italy, because when they joined all of the three sections of Italy into United Italy, they needed a king. And so who did they use? They used the Savoys, and the Savoy seat was here.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Savoy family had Palazzo Madama, which was for the queen who became the queen.
Mm-hmm.
And so when they had their very first democratic stuff in Turin, they used that as the seat of the government. And so then they moved to Florence. They moved the seat of the government to Florence, and then they moved the seat of the government to Rome eventually. Well, nowadays, if you hear on the news here in Italy, they'll say, oggi a Palazzo Madama, blah, 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 in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
They're talking about the seat of the government. But
Yes.
wherever the seat of the government in Italy is now called Palazzo Madama.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was originally in this Palazzo Madama in Turin. So I think that's fascinating and kind of cool. I
wonder if you know my second favorite museum in Torino after the Egyptian Museum.
Which one?
Il Museo della Frutta, the Museum of Fruit. Do you know?
Oh, that's what I've missed.
This is the magnificent museum.
Bauda, which I love.
No, I mean, there are the famous ones, and they're all great, and people should go. But the Museum of Fruit is just something astonishing.
I bet.
It's so Italian. It's in the University District, and it's actually in a building in the university.
Okay,
and
I've got to go.
There was a man, one of these wonderful creative Italians about 200 years ago, who decided to carve models of every known pear, every known apple, and every known grape in Italy.
Oh, wow.
And in addition, there are other fruits too, but primarily apples, pears, and grapes.
I wonder if there are a lot of those that are extinct now.
They are. And part of why we go is to study homology, which is the study of the fruit, but especially the apple, to see what was there.
Wow.
And he carefully, had a beautiful handwriting, would write the names and the descriptions and the seasons and the fragrance and the taste and so on. Just astonishing. So incredibly Italian.
Yeah. Well, I'm always joking whenever we get a group of Italians together, it takes them about 10 or 15 minutes. And this is men or women. And eventually somebody will come out with a recipe. Yeah. Because they end up talking about food, but everybody's like, oh no, but I put a little bit of oil on that and I cook it a little bit before I put the thingy. And every meal, not even just meals, but just conversations in general with Italians, you give them 10, maybe 15 minutes and somebody will come out with a recipe. And I think it's hilarious because I'm like, okay, it's been 10 minutes. Where's our recipe?
But, Torino is also one of the world capitals of coffee. Yeah. And the famous company there is Lavazza. Giuseppe Lavazza was my guest about 3 years ago.
What? No way.
On the show. And he was one of the first people in Italy to pioneer corporate funding of the arts. Now, you and I as Americans, especially as Texans and New Yorkers, understand corporate funding of the arts. But in Europe, it would come from the state.
Well, it does.
Giuseppe felt that it was important to also have, underwriting. And yes, obviously, Lavazza coffee is a wonderful coffee, and it helps associate, say, with the Teatro Regio or the Egyptian Museum.
Yeah, but let me add to that, because the problem here in Italy, in the States, a company, if they give $100, then they write off $100. Or if you would give 100,000, you write off 100,000 from your taxes. So you've lowered your taxes. Here in Italy, that is not the case. So if
Or
Milan
Austria or
gives
Switzerland.
money,
Yeah.
if they're giving money, they're really just giving money because they don't
Mhm.
get many perks at all
Yeah.
tax wise for doing it, which is one reason why we need to be so heavily funded here in Italy for education and all these things, because you don't get this underwriting write-off tax wise from companies that give money. And
Hmm.
so so it's a different system. And back when Berlusconi was around, he said he decided, oh, we're going to go to the American system, which need, for the arts. So, we need sponsors. Well, number one, you've got all sorts of people who've been working in sponsorship and finding all that and whatever, and have studied that in the US. In Italy, you don't have that
Hmm.
as a faculty in your university. So nobody really
Yep.
knows how to do it. And then secondly, you don't have the tax system to support that, because
Yep.
it's not the same tax system. So you can't say, oh, we're going to go to the American system without giving the perks.
Hmm.
So he kind of screwed over the arts in that way, because got everybody thinking, oh, well, they need to be paid for on their own, other than saying, okay, these are very important parts of our culture here. This is the culla dell'opera. This is
The
the
cradle.
birthplace, the cradle of
Yeah.
opera. And just recently that opera has been named a bene culturale del mondo. I don't know
A
what,
cultural treasure by
a
UNESCO.
cultural treasure by UNESCO.
Yeah.
And so hopefully that will mean a little bit more moolah from somewhere to keep it alive and keep it going, because it's just really expensive to put on if you're going to put it on in today's market. If you're going to pay people a living wage,
Hmm.
and that's it just costs a lot more than slave wages that they probably had back in the day when people lived
Yep.
in a hovel.
Yep.
And yeah, so
Well, for the concluding part of our conversation, I want to talk about your activities. I want it to be on faith that the listeners know that you're a fabulous singer, and
I
you
hope.
have my full endorsement. I've heard you from the beginning, and therefore they can explore your artistry on. You have a website, lauraclaycomb.com,
Yeah.
and find out what you're up to. But you have, as I think people have heard today, a lot of history as a student and as someone who's been taught, and you are a vessel more than many singers I know who are not ancient, because you're not ancient, you're still in your career. No, I mean that. Many singers
Doing a
retire
whole
and
lot,
teach,
but yeah.
but many singers retire and teach.
Ah.
And and then there are singers in your age group and even younger who do master classes. But
Mm-hmm.
you actually do teaching, which is different from master classes, great though
Yeah.
they are, um, because you focus differently, because you're focusing on the development of the singer that you're working with. And some people may have a lot of potential and others a lot of raw talent. Some
Mm.
people may have nothing, some people may have everything. But nonetheless, just hearing you talk about the people who taught you and how they taught you makes me want to ask, especially because, yes, you've taught in Moscow and you've taught elsewhere, but you're teaching primarily in Italy.
Yeah, I am right now. Well, I had kids really, 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 really late.
Your own
And so
kids, yeah, yeah,
6 years ago,
yeah.
I had my son, and 4 years ago, I had my girl, my daughter. And as a result, I didn't want to be traveling 8 or 9 months out of the year all the time. And so that kind of curtailed a lot of stuff. And then, the pandemic happened, and I was kind of like, oh, you start to re-examine the whole habit trail, if anybody still remembers what that is,
Hmm.
of this career, which means you're just, on the little wheel going all the time. And so I kind of stepped off of it for a little while. I went, oh, hey, it's kind of nice being home. So I do a few concerts now and then, and I've been working on an album that I'm gonna do, because that's something that I can control, and I don't have to worry about somebody else hiring me, or, worrying, oh, do they like me or do they not? I've kind of been there, done that. I've had an over 30-year career, and I started when I was 20. So, I've been around, and I've kind of been there, done that a lot. And so I didn't want to compromise my level of things,
Hmm.
because I think in order to sing on certain levels, a lot of times you have to be on that habit trail. You have to be 100% in the game, so people go, oh, she's still singing and we've heard her and blah blah blah. Nobody knows nowadays. I think a lot of companies nowadays have started re-auditioning people, especially after the lockdown, because people were out of work for a year and weren't
Hmm.
singing and got out of shape vocally as
Yeah.
well. And so I thought, do I really want to be going around auditioning for people? Not really, because I never really auditioned much in my career anyhow. So I'm not very good at it, I don't think. I don't know. But so anyhow, I thought, I really have always wanted to be able to uh, do more of a continued teaching with people,
Hmm.
because I would have people come, when I'm in town, or even when I was singing, if somebody would come and work with me, and take a few lessons when I had a day off, and on in between rehearsals and blah 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 blah. But I never felt like that could really reach them as much, because you need time to just kind of
Hmm.
to digest, and
Yeah.
to take in everything, and actually put it into practice, because it's muscle memory you're working with. So I've always wanted to have a kind of home where I could invite people to be here year round. And that had been difficult, because I've taught off and on when I've been home. But that was so kind of far and few between that I couldn't have any kind of continuity.
Hmm.
And sometimes when I'd be home for a few months or whatever, I would have somebody come and spend an entire month with me,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. But that's not enough time to really get the work done. And so I
Hmm.
always wanted, and so now that I'm in one place, I thought, well, okay, I've been teaching people, but those are mainly people that already are in Europe or already in Italy. I
Hmm.
couldn't invite, I had a bunch of people, a couple of Canadians and some Americans, who wanted to come study with me, but they couldn't get a student visa because I'm not a program. I'm a person. And so I couldn't invite them to be a student, because they weren't enrolled in a program. So I've been developing a program with the Accademia di Pinerolo. It's actually di Pinerolo Torino now,
Hmm.
and it's a postgraduate academy. So in the past, they've done mainly master classes and kind of shorter termed stuff, and they've done courses of perfezionamento year round, which were mainly just lessons
Hmm.
uh, with fantastic instrumentalist teachers, because they did not have a vocal program until now.
Hmm.
And so in the past few years, they have developed for their instrumentalists, they developed a program which is a postmasters. So it's, I don't want to call it a doctorate, but it's kind of doctorate-ish
Hmm.
level. So I don't, maybe it could be either a doctorate, because you have a thesis that you have to defend. Either a doctorate or like an artist diploma kind of program that's a 2-year program. And it is the only postmasters program in music in all of Italy.
Hmm.
I will repeat that. If once you get a master's in Italy, you can't go any further until our program. And
Uh-huh.
so they've been doing that for the past 3 or 4 years with the instrumentalists, and now we're starting up in the fall. We're going to start up this new program for singers. And I'm also on the side, because that's mainly for people who already speak Italian, because you have to have a certain level of Italian already to do it. Not to mention, have a master's already and whatnot. But I'm going to be starting up a program that's a 1-year perfezionamento, so perfectioning program, that is going to be for foreigners. So what I have envisioned is that they will do voice lessons with me every week. They'll have a coaching every week, and they will have intensive Italian lessons, language lessons, and intensive diction, lyric diction lessons. And then we'll also have dramatic interpretation classes every week. Am I missing something? And then at the end of all of this, we'll have auditions, professional auditions, to try to, help them find their way into, agents and houses and that sort of thing. So that's a 1-year program. And what I'm envisioning is starting it out bilingually, so doing English and Italian the first 4 months. And then in month 5, they better have their act together, because I'm going to start doing everything in Italian at that. So it'll be really, get your feet wet, but then full immersion towards the end, so that you really will have to be fluent in a certain way, at least with a certain level at a certain point, to know, what's going on. So that's my part of the program at the academia that I've been kind of dreaming of doing for a while, because I think what is missing a lot of times is this dramatic interpretation as well, and being able to get things up on their feet and in your body, and learn, if you don't already have a body, a repertoire of movement in your body naturally. Some people are natural actors, and they don't need somebody to teach them to, look up there, open up, or whatever. But I needed to be taught that a gesture has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then what do you do with your arms once you've gotten them there, And I needed to be taught, where to put my eyes and that sort of thing. So over my career, some of my most favorite reviews have always been compliments on my acting, because I worked so hard to get that under my belt, because I knew I was not a good actor. I was like, in the very beginning. So I think it's a shame that I just keep that for me. And I think it's also a shame that all of these things that I was able to bring together, the Hans Hotter and the Regina Resnick and the Regina Crespin and Antonino Tonini, all of these things, I think it would be such a shame if I just kind of kept them for myself. And I'm not able to just pass that on and give that back, so that people can, and I also think I've come to a synthesis of a lot of things as well, that can help kind of be a shorthand to get to get to the point a little bit quicker, maybe, hopefully, even though, it's just takes time and repetition to put all these synapses together, and all the layers of the onion that you have to put together to be a great artist. And I'm still taking voice lessons myself. I'm still reading treatises on the voice. I'm still, reading up on the latest in vocology. That's been my latest thing, is the science behind the singing voice. And it's fascinating, and there's just so much information, and we learn so much more as we go along. And you hope to be able to just give a little bit of that if you can, and kind of throw it at everybody, and hope that some of it will stick on them so that they can pass it on, because this isn't something that you can, just make a TikTok of and people will learn it. It's not a dance step.
There's a wonderful Italian word, tramandato, which basically means handed along, passed, not down, but handed along.
Or handed through.
Passed through.
Yeah, passed through.
And that's very much what we're talking about here. I understood early on that I was not going to be a singer, but that I would have a career in opera. And there were things that I could learn, not just my own benefit, but to be the vessel to then
Wow.
tramandare, to pass
Yeah.
it on elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I met you early on when I was already teaching, but a young teacher. And part of why I do this weekly program is to document people such as yourself
Wow.
who perhaps I'll say something that brings forth a lot of what you've just been saying so that
Mm.
it too is documented.
Yeah.
Because nowadays everything is so dispersed
Yeah. True.
and we don't quite know what's reliable in terms of information. So
Mm.
that I've spent, it'll be nearly 4 years now, every Friday having a guest
Wow.
who, in all the countries, all the languages, who can bring this experience. I do it to document, but I do it primarily to tramandare
Yeah.
using my guest.
Wow.
And
Wonderful.
with that, Laura Claycomb, I want to thank you, grazie, thank you, as they would say in Texas, because we've documented a lot today of
Thank
what I've always observed in you, and I knew that you would unstintingly give in conversation. So
you.
thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Of course.